What we're talking about tonight is the original Game of Thrones, which is the Wars of the Roses, which, wow, we're really having lots of noise, and that's on me. It was my phone. The Wars of the Roses. And so I don't know how familiar all of you are with that and how familiar if you've all been watching Game of Thrones, but of course that has been an international obsession, as everybody's been for the last many seasons been watching it, and of course it had its series conclusion on Sunday. So this TV phenomenon that's been going on for 2011 to 2019, based on a series of novels, in point of fact is also inspired by a series of English civil wars that culminated in 1455 to 1487. So there's a spoiler alert, which I forgot to make the last time. This lecture includes spoilers for Game of Thrones. Hey, Jane. Also, spoiler alert, this lecture includes spoilers for the Wars of the Roses. So, and just as a forewarning here, the Tudors unexpectedly win without a lot of foreshadowing. So there would be, if a lot of people I think would be complaining about the writing in terms of how it actually ends. So it wasn't what people thought. So Game of Thrones is essentially as a series. It's a political show, although it has all kinds of other things to it. It's a soap opera in some ways. It's a violent war show with lots of graphic violence and other kinds of things. But possibly at its heart, it's a political show, which is specifically a succession crisis where there's essentially a throne, the Iron Throne, and all of these great houses are struggling to see who will emerge as the new ruler of the realm of Westeros, which of the members of the great house, given the scenario that there's no one particularly great claimant. Essentially, in the long ago backstory of the series, there had been a house Targaryen that had ruled for a long, long time. It got overthrown in a rebellion. There has been for a whole long time a new king from one of the great houses, the House Baratheon, who was able to seal that through an alliance by marrying a Lannister, one of the other great houses. And at this point now, as that king dies, there's an additional succession crisis. In a lot of cases, a king who is a usurper like that is always living without a stable monarchy, and that's true also in history. So the Wars of the Roses are traditionally framed anyway. We'll get at this, whether this is an actual framework from the time period. It's actually not. It's traditionally framed as a dispute between two of the great houses of England, who were rival branches of the royal family. And so these are traditionally portrayed by the red rose and the white rose. So the House of Lancaster, the red rose, the House of York by the white rose. And unlike in Game of Thrones, which it's much more easy to comprehend this, but in Game of Thrones, when you have all the different lords, the Lord of the North, the Lord of the Reach, the Lord of the Riverlands, etc., they are actually in charge of that geographic area. And that's how things would have been in, let's say, central Middle Ages in France, where the Count of Anjou pretty well rules Anjou, or the Duke of Normandy rules Normandy, and the King of France has very little capacity to go into Normandy and do anything about it. And the Game of Thrones kingdom is sort of, 7 kingdoms are sort of like that, where each of these great lords is lord of their own respective area. England, though, by contrast, was never like that. And so from the time of the conquest, you may well be Duke of York, which means you take your title from this great city of the north, or great city for England back in the Middle Ages, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your lands are primarily there. And in fact, the Dukes of York didn't have very many lands in the area of York at all, and likewise, the Dukes of Lancaster also didn't own too much land in Lancaster. Instead, their lands are all around England, all spread around. And so this allowed, anyway, the fact that that was the case, it meant that England was much less able to simply have everybody break into little pieces as each king, each lord, local lord or duke, takes control of their territory, because in point of fact, they need to have a functioning royal government in order to get the revenues from their lands, which are spread all around the entire kingdom. And so it sets up a very different scenario, actually, than the one played out in Game of Thrones. Okay, so I'm just going to suggest here that the Game of Thrones names very closely match this inspiration, right? So these two great houses, Lancaster and York. So the great houses of Game of Thrones are Lannister, Lancaster here, and Stark, York, right? So it's not too far removed from George R.R. Martin has not actually, I think, done a lot of interviews where he's identified all these things. There's lots and lots of fans who have put together all of their fan theories, and I've worked from lots of those. But this one seems pretty obvious, right? Okay. So Game of Thrones its setting is a fantasy world, and it actually, all of the action, it's mostly about, the control of the seven kingdoms of Westeros, but a lot of the activity actually does take place over on the neighboring continent of Essos, and so at least anyway, one of the main characters, Daenerys, spends almost the whole series over there, and you ever wonder, is she ever going to come over and be part of the rest of the action with everybody else? But ultimately she does, obviously. Okay. Likewise, the Wars of the Roses are set primarily in the British Isles, and it's about really control of England, specifically England and Wales. But there's a lot of the story takes place across the British Channel, in the continent, and most specifically France. So France is the place that's really related and relevant to the Wars of the Roses, but up to and including what's now the Low Countries of Belgium and things like that. So Flanders, which was part of France at the time, and the related zones. Okay. Yes?
Would you mind explaining to us why the houses of York and
Lancaster.
So widely dispersed?
Okay.
Near where their so-called headquarters?
Yeah. So the question is why, in terms of, if we had back here at the Game of Thrones, the north up here, if I can see where it is, yeah. So the Starks, are rulers of this whole territory up here, and it is a kind of contiguous territory, and they're able at a certain point to call in bannermen from that whole land. And it doesn't take them that much to then have all of their bannermen just yell out, "King in the North!" And then suddenly they're all independent, so they just declare independence, and there's nothing really that the king that's down here in King's Landing can do about it. And that's true for all of the different places, like, for example, Dorne down in the south. So the Dornish people hardly have anything to do with the whole storyline, except for a couple little bits in the middle of this, the middle seasons, right? And so that's kind of how some places worked, and that's, like I say, how France worked in the Central Middle Ages. But England isn't like that, and the reason for it primarily is because of how wisely, essentially, the Norman kings divvied up the lands after the Norman conquest. So in 1066, as we know, the Duke of Normandy and all of his Norman knights conquered England. They ultimately, in the next couple decades, end up displacing and eliminating most of the existing Anglo-Saxon nobility. So because of a series of different rebellions and things like that, generally most of the Anglo-Saxon nobles get disinherited, or or their daughters get married into Norman lords, and so the families intermix at that point. And so when that happens, though, you may be aware of how William the Conqueror commissioned this great census of England called Doomsday Book, where they wrote down then what everybody owed and what everybody owned and what every little part of England was worth. And so when they did that then, to divvy up among all the different Norman knights and lords, they didn't just say, okay, you're going to be in charge of, you'll be in charge of, Cornwall, and you'll be now Lord of Cornwall, and you just get to rule it, Instead, you'll be the Duke of Cornwall, but I'm going to give you an estate here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And I'm going to make you be, Earl of Northumbria or whatever. I don't think they got to have that. But anyway, Earl of Chester. That's not a good example because actually Chester does rule that area. Earl of Essex. But I'm going to give you a state here and here and here and here and here and here. You know what I mean? So in other words, generally speaking, you would get a title, and that way you'd be able to be the equivalent of a French count. So the person who's the Count of Maine is functionally the same rank as the Earl of Essex in England. So both of them use the same Latin word comes, one for count, one for earl. But the one in France kind of controls their own territory, whereas the ones in England are essentially dependent on there being a functioning royal government in order to have those revenues from their lands. Because if suddenly there's a big civil war, what will happen is if you were sitting down here in your castle, then the king is going to confiscate all of your lands over here. You know what I mean? And so it ends up being structurally a stronger system that allows essentially the kingdom to have more power vis-a-vis the nobles. The nobles and the king therefore have to be in alliance with each other in order for medieval England to work.
I was just going to say that if you're the Duke of something and you want to raise a rebellion and take over the kingdom, then all your various possessions, the men that you can muster for soldiers, they're all over the place.
That's right.
So you can't do it.
Yeah, you can, but you just have to do it nationally. So it is a lot harder. What you can't do is simply hole up in your castles and say Cornwall is not going to be part of England anymore. We're just going to be down here and I'm going to be king of Cornwall, and the rest of you guys can be in England, and we're just never going to talk to you again. You can't really do that because, again, you lose all your estates. What you can do if you have a rebellion is you have to kind of gather everybody together and you have to have a big fight because otherwise you're going to have this, you won't be able to last. And so that does happen a bunch of different ways. Okay, so that was the different settings then here, British Isles and Europe. Okay, and so just to look at it, to see this kind of inspiration in the source material. So, here again is Westeros, the Seven Kingdoms, and there's the British Isles. We're maybe familiar with both maps. This map gets shown an awful lot. There's a bazillion versions of this. And of course, you've seen Britain before. So they don't entirely look the same, but if you move Ireland down here, and then if you blow it up bigger and turn it upside down, so now that's Ireland still, but it's blown up bigger and turned upside down. And now if you just flip like a mirror Britain, wow, that's a lot. You can lot clearer inspiration, about how that works. Now, just because the shapes work like that obviously doesn't mean that like this whole area of Westeros is like the corresponding parts of Ireland. It's not, right? So instead, the southern part is kind of like Spain, et cetera, so there's other kinds of inspirations. But you can kind of see where part of the idea of Game of Thrones, one of the reasons why George R.R. Martin is able to do something that's so rich is that he's taking real geography, he's taking real history, and he is just changing it a little bit here and there in order to have that depth that automatically exists in actual history. So we'll look at some more of that. So obviously in Britain and in Game of Thrones, obviously, this is Westeros, sorry, there's a vast wall that's separating the north of Westeros from the real north, which is to say the area beyond the wall, the part past civilization. And so this is a battle that occurs somewhere in the middle of the show where all of the wild peoples that live beyond the wall, including their giants and their mammoths, are all going and attacking the wall. Yes, Shaheen?
It's like Hadrian's Wall and the Picts.
It is like Hadrian's Wall. But actually the Scots. and so essentially, I don't know if the Scots like this analogy of being kind of the wild guys, on the other side. But maybe some of them do. But the idea of it here is even though this wall obviously is, in real life wall is less impressive than a wall that's raised by magic, it nevertheless is essentially a wall that's separating the north of the kingdom from the area beyond the kingdom. And it's from time immemorial, so it's not like it's something that had been made by anybody in the medieval English monarchy. It had been made, obviously, by the Romans, and still was kind of marking out that area of where the kingdom was, although it's not quite exactly on the border. The border varied a bit. Obviously, there's no White Walkers in Scotland. Yes?
I just want to add a fun fact. The actual wall where they shoot it is in Northern Ireland, and it's in like a pit.
Okay.
Like it's you can visit it.
Oh, okay, cool. So there is actually something you can go see. And so in a giant pit in Northern Ireland. But yeah, this is a bunch of computer-generated add-ons, but I guess for the close part, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Anyway, there's no White Walkers in Scotland, and yet I'm going to argue that actually, if the story had actually been about zombies as it was always threatening, so right from the very start of the series up until just a few episodes ago, winter is coming was what they were always foreshadowing, like this is all going to become like, what's the zombie show? Zombie apocalypse show? The Living Dead, yeah. Night of the Living Dead. So anyway, it's going to ultimately just going to devolve down to that, and we're going to have a zombie apocalypse show. But in fact, one of the things that was true, I think, in terms of magic, in terms of a story, is that magic can be easy come and easy go. And so once something happens by magic, it also can go away by magic. And indeed, actually, way back when these books first came out, and I was very excited about the first one because I like this sort of medieval, historically based political intrigue. When the very first king gets wiped out based on magic, so essentially Renly Baratheon just gets assassinated by a ghost spirit thing. And I'm just like, okay, well, this is absurd because now it doesn't have any, none of the things that a king can do, is relevant because any random person who has magic can just go boom and wipe them out. And so anyway, that made me stop reading the books, although I have watched the series. So anyway, yeah. Anyway, so I'm not. This is just a bias on my part. In other words, I think what's more compelling about the story is actually the fact that it's a political story, as opposed to if it had just been a zombie story. So, as part of this backdrop, again, there's no White Walkers, but there are people north of the Wall in England, and so through the 14th through the 16th centuries, so the late Middle Ages, early modern time period, Scotland twice resisted English attempts at conquest in the 14th century. So Edward the First, who is credited in England of being the conqueror of Wales, who built all of those amazing castles as a way to subjugate and integrate the Welsh people into his kingdom of England, and then who made his son be the Prince of Wales, which is why we have Prince of Wales as an appanage, which is to say the title given to the king's heir. And that's also why we have this very weird title in England, in English, prince. It didn't exist before this time. Prince just means ruler. It's derived again from that title of Augustus, Caesar Augustus. And so prince and princess is a modern kind of English concept and a use of a word that meant something quite different. But it becomes to mean that because of this traditional title given to the heir of the king or queen of England, the Prince of Wales. So that same king, Edward I, attempted to conquer Scotland a couple times and did not succeed really, although caused a lot of havoc up there. And as a result of that, in the next generations, during the 100 Years' War that England fights against France, the Scots formed what's called the Auld Alliance with France against England. And so England then was continuously open to the threat of invasion from the north in the same way that in Game of Thrones, the people in the north, at first they're only thinking of the White Walkers as old wives' tales. And they're more concerned about the wildlings, the actual human beings from beyond the wall, coming across and raiding and burning stuff, pillaging and going back. And that particular thing is quite real in terms of the inspiration between the kind of continual border warfare that took place between Scotland and England. Both sides. So the English knights would go across the Scottish border, raid and all that kind of thing, and come back too. And in a lot of cases, there's open warfare between the two. But essentially, England, which otherwise has had, generally speaking, a much easier time by anytime you get to be sitting on an island like Japan, it's very hard to take over comparatively to when you are sitting around like Poland and you just don't even have any frontiers that make any sense. You don't have a mountain range or anything that's like, why does Poland start here or stop there? Which is why if you see through history, Poland moves around on the map and then also sometimes ceases to exist. This doesn't happen as anywhere near as easily in England, but they do have this kind of one place where they're vulnerable, this one flank, and the French. One thing that the French are good at in this is exploiting that in this time period. Okay, so Westeros then was separated from Essos by this narrow sea. And the same way the British Isles are separated from Europe by the English Channel, so separated from Flanders and France. And then this, in both cases, Essos and also Flanders and France, becomes a location for exiles. So every time you're on the outs, you just run across the channel and you can go immediately start, depending on how important you are, it's quite easy to go start living at the court of the King of France, who will pay you a pension and all that kind of thing as you are waiting to be able to be used as a tool against France's enemy, which is to say your enemy, the king. Likewise, if you're on the outs with the King of France and you also get kicked out of England, then you go to Flanders because then the Count of Flanders will do the same thing for you because, you have to be allies and enemies with somebody. So exiles are able to run over there. They're also able usually to get money. So often the King of France will give a whole bunch of money to go back and disrupt England. You might otherwise be able to borrow a whole bunch of money. And of course, you can also recruit armies, some mercenary armies. And so some examples of these kind of exiled nobles. So at the beginning of Game of Thrones, the TV show, the last scions of the Targaryen house, Viserys and Daenerys, they have fled to the free city of Pentos. They're there for refuge, and they also want to raise an army so that they can go back and take back their throne, or rather their father's throne. And so then in the same way in the Wars of the Roses, at a certain point, King Edward IV, who was from the House of York, he loses a battle and he ends up having to flee the realm, and so he gets deposed because he's left the kingdom and another king comes back and takes back over. And so while then he's off, he lives in Flanders for a year. He's there for refuge, he raises an army, and he goes back. Likewise, Henry Tudor, quite as a young, not as anywhere near as important as the king, anyway, a young noble of the House of Lancaster goes to France where he grows up and stuff like that for refuge, again getting pensions from the King of France and then ultimately getting a whole army and getting sent back in order to cause havoc in England, right? So Essos and Europe are a great source for mercenary armies. They don't always do much for you, but sometimes they do. So this is a problem with mercenary armies. So in this particular case, in the last season of Game of Thrones, there's this renowned company of mercenaries, the Golden Company, and they get hired by Cersei, but don't end up doing anything, right? So, and could have, but they might have, but you don't never know what's going to happen. By contrast, not mercenaries, but Daenerys ends up gathering a whole set of armies, so that the Thrakis and also the Unsullied, who are essentially the Mamluks from Egypt, and so by bringing them, the Egyptian Mamluks and the Mongols, filling her boats up with those, she's able to be a much more effective when she gets across. Stannis Baratheon also went and got a bunch of mercenaries that the Gold Bank paid for, Bravos paid for. And they worked really well defeating the wildlings, but then they all get killed by the people in the north, right? Okay, so mercenary armies, and everybody gives them in real life, but also in the show. Also, just like this, the Bank of Bravos, so that Iron Bank, it's busily funding the Iron Throne. So at the beginning of the show, the crown is just in a horrific debt, and so it owes all this money to the Lannisters, it owes all this money to the Iron Bank, and that only gets more and more and more and more in debt as time goes on. Later, the various factions in the Civil War, in order to, the bank kind of essentially starts taking sides in order to try to get a king on the throne or a queen on the throne that's going to honor the debts. And so initially, backs Stannis, but then Stannis gets wiped out, and so then backs Cersei, because the idea is the Lannisters always pay their debts, and so essentially the bank makes that, well, ultimately both very bad bets. And so you would think that, we don't get to see it, but you would think that when they finally do the audits of the Iron Bank, that the result of the Game of Thrones is that the Iron Bank of Braavos is probably bankrupt. Because they spent so much money and they probably lost it all. There's no particular reason you can imagine that anybody, Bran, who ends up being king at the end, needs to pay any of Cersei's loans or Stannis' loans or anybody else's. So, yes?
Colossus of Rhodes.
Yeah, so the inspiration for the statue is the Colossus of Rhodes, and obviously that's also true for the Statue of Liberty. So, just to say, inspired by the Colossus of Rhodes. Anyway, likewise, Italian banks funded the English crown in the late Middle Ages, early modern period, and they also, at a certain point when this English Civil War, when the Wars of the Roses break out, they put their thumb on the different sides. We mentioned Edward IV when he had to flee the realm and he's hanging out in exile in Flanders. The Medici Bank, the Medici being these famous banker rulers of the city of Florence, their local bank on the scene makes a very large and unwise loans to Edward, and ultimately the bank collapses. So even though Edward wins, so it's still something he was definitely the inspiration is right there, you can see. So the traditional narrative, the Wars of the Roses, let's go through it a little bit. So just going back in terms of context, so I mentioned Edward I, who conquers Wales and also attacks, Longshanks he's called, so he's the king from Braveheart, which is, I just mentioned that, but it's actually a terrible movie historically. It's a good, there's some things that are good about the movie, but anyway, it's not good history. But in any event, that king, his son then, Edward II, had been deposed in 1327. So this is one of the, we talked a little bit before when we did the Magna Carta lecture, and we saw how kind of close King John came to also getting deposed. And so the only way that, one of the ways he tried to kind of avoid getting deposed was by issuing this Magna Carta, which was meant as a compromise to appease all of the nobles who were in rebellion against him. But he also had no intention of ever fulfilling Magna Carta, and they didn't believe he was going to do it either, and so that immediately broke out into war again. And the only reason particularly that that didn't continue was that John just ended up dying. And so then his son, Henry III, who was a child still, the new nobles who take over as his regents reissue Magna Carta in his name, and that's why Magna Carta, has continued down with us. He renounces it too, and everybody continues to do that. That's part of the tradition for a whole century after Magna Carta, is that kings issue it, and then when they have to, and then they take it back, when they don't have to anymore. So now we get to Edward II. He's deposed, and so this is so Henry III also came close. So the English crown is therefore unstable when the kings are not able to keep that alliance going with the nobles. And Edward II's problem is that he ends up having favorites. And so it's probably like William Rufus, like James, I think the first, or James II. Anyway, so like several other examples, is probably one of the gay kings of England. But in this case, his favorites that he would fall for, he gave way too much power to, and they then ended up acting in ways that the rest of the nobles didn't feel was fair. And so when that happens, that made it so that the normal function between the kings and the nobility is broken. What the nobles need is somebody to arbitrate between their property and other disputes that they're continuously having with each other. And so you need kind of a neutral arbiter. if the king is putting it all in one particular noble, and that noble is getting all of this kind of favoritism, that's the thing that makes the system, one of the things that makes the system break down. And so that happened for Edward II. So he gets deposed, a faction of the nobles with his wife as well end up taking power. They rule in the name of his son, Edward III, who came to the throne at the age of 14. He himself, though, is able to, when he becomes of age, he breaks free of their tutelage and punishes his mom and the other rebels that had happened. He then went on to rule for 50 years and set the 100 Years' War between England and France into motion. As the traditionally told, then the War of the Roses traced back to his death, the death of King Edward III in 1377. So you can imagine after you've had a half a century of one king's rule, it's sort of like now, where we've had Queen Elizabeth as the longest reigning monarch in British history. It's very hard for anybody to remember what it was like to have a different monarch than Elizabeth, and so it will be very different. Same thing true for when Edward passed away. So essentially where we were at, we saw back when we did Magna Carta that John had lost most all of the land that his parents had in France. And so if we take here orange as the realm of France and green as English possessions, so by the time we're getting to Edward III, essentially they mostly have this little strip left of what had been Aquitaine. So it had been this whole area, and now they're kind of just down to kind of a coastal enclave. And so then, in the course of his section of the 100 Years' War, they make some pretty dramatic victories, and they have a couple just key battles that the Crecy and Poitiers, where the French are not adapted to the new styles. They're still essentially fighting according to kind of the old knight levies and chivalry and things like that, whereas the English have adopted a more professional army where they are paying mercenaries, and then mercenaries specifically are using bows that penetrate armor. And so as the knights are all rushing over their own infantry on the French side in order to be part of this chivalric charge, they're just getting mowed down by these archers. And so as a result of that, France has to agree to a series of humiliating treaties that allow the English to retake a bunch of their territory in the continent. Okay. What ends up happening, though, because Edward has this entire long reign, that's written the wrong way around. Yeah. Anyway, his eldest son predeceases him. And so Edward the Black Prince, who had been one of these very popular knights, a flower of chivalry, in the 100 Years' War, he dies then before his father, a year before his father. He leaves a son, and so then a year later, when his father dies, skipping a generation, therefore, this child is crowned at age 10, Richard II, when his grandfather dies. And so just as with what happened when we talked about this with Magna Carta. So when Richard the Lionhearted, John's brother, dies without any children, the option is, well, we can have the middle brother's son, Arthur, who's a 10-year-old kid or whatever, he could become king, or we can have an adult brother, John, take over, which is what happened. Well, minority rule, which is to say a rule by a child king during their minority, so not the kind of minority. Anyway, so I'll say boy king rule is problematic for all kinds of reasons, but one of them is that the nobles lack that arbiter, because essentially there's a regency council where the nobles are in charge, and so one noble is not trusted by the others, right? And so they decide to go with John, and so anyway, there's always that kind of instability at the time of succession. And so we have that again here, where suddenly now, after this very, very long reign of Edward III, we have the reign of a boy. So just to look at that lineage, how it goes, then the crown jumps a generation from Edward III up there to Richard II. And then he has all these uncles that are still alive, the Duke of Clarence, the Duke of Lancaster, the Duke of York, who are all still kind of around. and who, in the case of the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, end up taking control of the government in their little nephew's name.
So why wouldn't succession just pass to one of the brothers automatically?
Right. So, so at this point now, more so than what happened when John was around, there has been now developing a sense of primogeniture. So the way which is to say, the oldest inherits, and so because when Edward, the Black Prince is born, then obviously he outranks then his younger brothers in terms of who's the heir, right? And so he's the Prince of Wales. But then when he has a son, that son trumps the brothers, right? And so that's what happens today. So as in England, for example, as William, keeps having kids, those kids make Harry's claim, go down every single time, right? So Harry is less likely to become king the more kids, William has, right? And so anyway, that's sort of how it is, although it doesn't have to be, and the brothers are still kind of aware of that. And so there is still always a sense that when there's a minority going on, that maybe actually what we should do is, put somebody trusted on the throne. And certainly the different brothers argue that at different times. So, crowned at age 10, Richard II initially falls under the regency of his uncles, especially John of Gaunt. When he assumed control as an adult, he again did this thing, like Edward II, where he favors a small group of courtiers. In doing that and always going on their side, in other words, and also by operating almost entirely with a household that is mercenary troops as opposed to the traditional knights. It makes it so the traditional knights and the traditional nobility feel like they're being neglected or that they aren't getting kind of fair treatment, and it causes a breakdown then of the alliance between crown and the nobles. And so when that discontent among the wider nobility happens, those nobles then all get together. They have a coup where they more or less take control of the king's person, and they set up kind of an informal council where they now are going to get to make all the decisions on the king's behalf. And so that's one of the things that happens here for Richard II. What? Are you asking a question, Jane, or are you getting? Okay, no, hold it towards your mouth.
Have we any idea why, who constituted the group that Richard favored?
Yes, so it's the ones that he favored?
Yeah. I mean, on the strength of what did he favor them?
Yeah, so...
and the others resent them.
And so I haven't read it as closely as I should in terms of that. What I think it is, again, there's speculation that these are maybe people made the same kind of insinuations about him as Edward II, and so they're favorites of his. They're potentially just lower on the nobility level, but maybe are good at chivalry and other kinds of things like that made them attractive. Yeah, so flattering and stuff like that. And so so this isn't necessarily a something that's going to get knock you down and knock you out as a king. It's just a thing that causes discontent among the greater nobles, and so then the greater nobles aren't likely to come to your aid if you need it, and that ends up being one of the problems that he has. He faces a lot of different crises. So he actually also early on there was actually a revolt of what's called a peasants' revolt, but it's actually of also the lower nobles or the lowest, the merchant class and things like that. And so he actually does this thing where he faces them down, and when he's having a parley with them and their leaders. And because their leaders aren't noble born, they just the nobles take the leader and kill him right in front of all of essentially the peasant rebels, and then having a gutsy brave kid, the guy rides forth into the kind of the peasant mob or whatever and says, I am your captain now. I will be your leader. I will give you all that you want. You're going to have it all fulfilled. And so, and then he orders them once they've agreed and they all cheer. Then he sends them all home, and then they later hunt down all the ringleaders and have them all killed. of the revolt. And so that gave him a sense that he had like a real serious divine power to his kingship, because he was able to do this really gutsy thing. But then, anyway, as a result of that, he later, though, was alienating some of the other nobles who he didn't feel like he needed. That might be the answer, yeah.
What age is adult?
So it varies. So I guess I think of it as being 18, but that's anachronistic. So actually, a lot of these boy kings are really taking control, in some cases fairly unsupervised, at like 13 and 14 and stuff like that. Often it'll be 16, but it can be any number. It varies from king to king to king. It's not a big enough sample size, but it's generally speaking, as quickly as they're able to. So in a lot of cases, the nobles will want them to take control. In other cases, the nobles who are controlling them, the boys will want to take control for themselves. And so depending on which one it is, like with Edward III, he was able to take control of his reign, having escaped his mother and her boyfriend. Anyway. So,
wasn't the age for marrying? I think for girls, for women, it was age 12, where you could consent to your own marriage, and for I think boys it was 14 to 16 or something, and so you were considered an adult from the age when you could consent to your own marriage.
Yeah, and so it could be. I mean, it depends on the. So again, all of the royals and nobles, though, are always exceptions, and so they will marry the girls off, or at least they'll have like a kind of a faux marriage. They won't consummate the marriage until you'll get to that kind of time period. But because the alliance is so important, you may well. Even an older king may well marry a 4-year-old girl, in order to have that alliance, in order to get the dowry, in order to cause a peace, even if that girl doesn't then come and live at the court and act as a queen, until much, much later than that. So I would say that there isn't a hard, fast rule about when a king comes of age. It depends on the individual almost entirely, and so whenever they're able to. So in this case, I don't have the exact date here, right? So he's crowned when he's 10, and then anyway, within the next few years, he is able to take control. But then, anyway, as he does, then and he has his own independent rule that gets rolled back by these lords appellant, they're called. And so the lords appellant are able to rule for Richard for a while. But then he regains power from them, gets away from them, and takes control again. And when he does, then he really punishes them all. And so this is the thing then that really pisses off all of the nobles, because now they're getting things like killed and deposed and exiled and all those kind of things. And so having exiled them all that didn't get killed, one of these, Henry of Bolingbroke, who is the Duke of Lancaster, returns from exile with an army. And when he does that after besieging a castle, he captured Richard II and forces him to abdicate in Henry's favor. So in other words, as the Duke of Lancaster, he is also now a descendant of Edward III. So he's just in a different house. So Richard is from the Black Prince, and so this the Duke of Lancaster here is a descendant of the uncle. So it's a cousin. Right, so Richard then in the little image here is surrendering his crown to Henry IV, as he now becomes the first Lancaster king. So Henry IV then takes the crown in 1399, and Richard, once he's captive, dies in captivity. It's very dangerous to keep a deposed king in prison very long. They don't actually tend to last. So Edward II also got killed. Richard II dies. In general, once you got a hold of a king, usually, anyway, you've got to kill him, because otherwise what's going to end up happening is that anybody who is discontented with the new king's reign, and the new king is a usurper, so the new king's reign is always unstable. If there's the old king, if he can just be captured, even if they aren't able to do anything, if you just have hold of them, you can argue that you are having a legitimate cause, right? So anyway, so Richard dies pretty quickly. The Lancasters are now here, these new kings. They're descended from Edward III's third surviving son, John of Gaunt. But, by the way, the older son, the one son in between the Black Prince and John, Lionel, has his own descendants that are still alive. So Edward Mortimer, for example. And so as a result, if we go back to that primogeniture idea, those guys technically have a better claim to the throne than Henry IV and his descendants. Although those guys are wise enough not to mention that. so in point of fact, they're off in Ireland and that kind of thing, and they end up assenting to the Lancaster rule, and Henry IV then has a long and pretty successful reign. So Henry IV dies in 1413, and he leaves the throne to his adult son, Henry V. And so he actually has a son. That son grows to adulthood and gets trained essentially as a warrior in the wars of the 100 Years' War, and also in government and that sort of thing. And then when the old king dies, the new king is able to take over without any of this kind of minority rule or somebody being deposed. And so that's the first time that there had been an orderly succession like that, father to adult son, since Edward II had been crowned in 1308. So when Edward I went to Edward II, obviously then Edward II was deposed, and this has been ongoing ever since then. And so that causes stability, right? So these other moments when kings are getting deposed, when they're fighting these kind of civil wars, when there's a child king, all of those cause instability. So despite the potential claims of his cousins, then the Lancasters under a strong king are really in full control, although this is later reinterpreted as an ongoing dynastic struggle. There's really no struggle in this era of what's called the Wars of the Roses. So Henry V, very famously, continues this prosecution or reinvades France after there'd been a lull. And again, he has one of these spectacular English victories. These are the things that England's still living on. These three great victories, but Agincourt is, one more of them. And this one is just causes a total defeat of France. So Henry V's victory, Charles VI of France, in the Treaty of Troyes, agrees that he's going to marry his daughter Catherine of Valois to Henry V, and that he will himself then disinherit his own son, the heir to France. And so we talked about how the heirs to England are called the Prince of Wales. Well, the heirs to the throne of France are called the Dauphins of, what's it called? It's down here anyway. I forget where the Dolphins are from, but anyway, the title is the Dolphin. So what ended up happening was the last Dauphin, who had been an independent ruler, left his county to the King of France, so long as his title would be preserved as the appanage title for the king's heirs. And so that's why it's on the tip of my tongue where the Dauphins were ruler of. anyway, the Dolphins, that was what that title comes from, and that's why they're called that. Anyway, so the Dauphin is disinherited. What's going to happen is after Charles dies, then Henry and his descendants by Catherine will be the kings of France, in addition to being kings of England, according to the Treaty of Troyes. So, in some sense then, if the story had ended here, so Henry V, marries Catherine of Valois. She gives birth right away to a son who's named for his father, so little baby Henry. And that might have been really a happily ever after moment, for the story. If they'd stopped writing the story there and wrote heavily after, you'd definitely think there's going to be a different outcome than what actually happens. But instead, so what had happened up to that point is that the king had reestablished the English monarchy on a strong footing by reasserting that alliance with the nobility, by being militarily successful. That always helps everybody's PR as a medieval lord or monarch if you actually go to one of those rare battles like Agincourt and then actually win it, then that pretty much assures the rest of your reign. You really hardly have to do anything more militarily. And he ultimately realizes then his ancestors' ambition, Edward III, who launched this claim that he was actually the rightful king of France, which was really just a pretense, so that was just a pretense back then. They never thought they'd ever get to accomplish that, but all they really wanted was to get some of their lands in France back, and more importantly, actually, the French were threatening their trade that England had with Flanders. So essentially, the entire economy of England at this point is based on the fact that wool is exported to Flanders and made into wool garments and things like that. And so not only is that essential for all English landowners who are raising sheep and selling wool, but it's actually a vast portion of the king's revenues because there's an export duty. And so the king's coffers are filled up with wool exports. Anyway, so the French were threatening that trade. And so we more or less, when that happens, Edward III more or less says, well, then I'm king of France. And they go across to have this war and things like that, but really they had no idea it was going to work. Anyway, so at this point, it works. And so Henry V has won. And then he contracts dysentery and dies. So anyway, and so he's 35 only when that happens. And so his son and heir, Henry VI, is only a few months old. So what ends up happening again is that Henry V's brother, John, Duke of Bedford, becomes head of the family and also head of a regency council. So Catherine of Valois is not trusted at all. So she's French. She's potentially on the French side of all this. And so she ultimately is sent off to her estate somewhere and kept out of the reign.
No need for the mic for a minute. I thought that title was referring to Donald Trump.
Yeah, more instability as an infant assumes the throne. Yes, it's been very unstable since that happened. Okay, so anyway, Henry VI now is technically, what ends up happening is that, and the next year after Henry V dies, then Charles of France dies. And so technically this little baby is king of England and France. It's amazing. So what a mess. So of course they have to set up then a regency council. And I said again already, part of the function of medieval kings is to act as an arbiter for the interests of the individual nobles. So this feature just can't function when a council of nobles is ruling in the name of a child king, as all of those individual nobles continue to have their own competing interests. And so essentially anybody who is on the council, anybody who's there, everybody else who's not around gets upset and they feel like their interests aren't being upheld. If they can, they try to come to the council and kick their enemies off the council. They want to seize control of the king's person so that they can be leading it, and that kind of thing is just incessant, more or less. And that happens also under Henry VI's rule as a boy king. So the fact, though, that even though we've had this happen a bunch of different times, like with Richard II, the passing over also of Arthur's claims in terms of John, the fact that Henry VI was not deposed in his childhood, despite the fact, as we already showed, that the Lancasters here have, in a sense, they had initially less good a claim than some of their cousins. Nevertheless, it shows that because of how popular, especially Henry V had been, that now the Lancaster monarchy is actually established on a very firm footing. And so the council rules in a way that is relatively conservative in terms of its policies. What it probably needed to do in terms of where they were at with France is continue to attack until they were able to defeat the forces of the Dauphin, who continued to rule as an independent leader in southern France. And of course we have, instead what happens is there's the Joan of Arc story where France starts to rally and the English are beaten back again and again. So in the face then of these losses in France and the kind of ongoing upheaval as all of the different nobles fight against each other and the king isn't there to separate them, the regents essentially are very happy to surrender power and say, okay, it's up to you now, kid king. So now the king is 16, so he's declared of age and now he will rule in his own right, and the council dissolves. But now we come to what was a very unusual and unique problem that happened with this particular king, and possibly not really so much with any others. There had been weak kings who essentially fell under the sway of individual favorites like Edward II, who ultimately ended up getting deposed for it. But Henry VI has a special characteristic and quality of apparently not having much will or interest or anything in ruling of his own. Maybe being a very, very simple mind, maybe having a number of other qualities that's very hard for us to piece that through the sources to find. There had been this genre of books in the Middle Ages called a mirror for princes, and those, essentially the monks who are writing those, pretty much list off all these things that kings should be worrying about, like being merciful, pious, generous, giving a lot of charity to monasteries. In other words, they're trying to do all those kind of things. And that all of those things naturally assumed that you'd have a king like Henry II or Richard the Lionhearted or John, who's just innately, let's say, very, has a big temper, and who is much more likely to, yell at you and run and try to, and be more likely to commit a massacre or something like that when they're being wronged, because they have this immensely strong will. And so the point of the mirror for princes is to temper that, and always to teach the kings to be temperate. With Henry VI, they have the opposite issue. So they have a king whose natural tendency is to be agreeable and to agree with everybody about everything, and to be totally unconcerned about any of his own rights or priorities or anything like that. I've got a great book that I've read on the War of Roses by Christine Carpenter, a scholar of this era, and she has gone through all the sources and reconstructed an argument anyway that Henry lacked these various qualities. So whenever anybody apparently got into his presence, he's sitting, he lives alone in the throne room or something like that, and you came up to him and you asked, boy, I'd sure like to be, Bishop of Exeter, because, I've been really good, and, all these kind of different things. Then he would, and I got a charter right here, he would seal it and say, yes, you're Bishop of Exeter. And if somebody came the next month and asked to be Bishop of Exeter, he'd make them Bishop of Exeter. And so you can imagine how that would immediately lead to chaos, since he's more or less doing whatever anybody is in his presence tells him to do. Yes, Jane.
Was he had some special relationship with the Catholic Church? That he was doing this in the name of Christian piety?
Well, yeah, so it's possible too. So the question is, is it because is simply very pious? Yeah. And it could be. So that's possibly it. There is something going on, and we can't necessarily tell because it's very hard from the sources that we have to do, let's say, some kind of psychological analysis or something like that. We do know ultimately that he's mentally unstable, and as we'll see, he at a certain point has a total breakdown and a fit of what in the Middle Ages is madness, where he maybe is schizophrenic, but in any event, he ceases to be able to even coherently talk. So what's going on the rest of the time, it's hard to say. It could be that he is actually just an ideal prince in terms of his piety, and so he's listened to all these churchmen who brought him up and want to be good and always be good and all this kind of thing, and maybe he did that. Or it could be that he has some kind of mental disability that has prevented him from, let's say, being fully mature ever. And so many of the sources also describe him as someone who never really matured, or that he continued, even though he had all this long 18 years or 16 years of being a child king, that he continued mentally to be a child king for his entire reign. And so it could be that there's some kind of a mental disability.
But it wasn't especially that the church supported his
No, it was. I only use that as an
would
example. Yeah, it's not the church specifically dominating him or anything like that. I just use that as an example of him assenting to anything anybody said. Yeah. Generally speaking, the major bishoprics, like another lordship, are part of the king's important retinue, and so they would have the king would have a capacity to help pick who the bishop was going to be. And that's what I meant there. Okay. Anyway, because the king would authorize whatever anybody in his vicinity asked, including, like I say, granting the same fief to multiple petitioners, the king's relatives then took an unprecedented step of reforming the Regency Council. So this never happened before where you had an adult king that has to have regents. In order to, more or less take control of the king's person and limit access so all of these people couldn't keep coming and asking him stuff. So they essentially, his counselors, again, resumed their ruling in his name. So functionally, though, this renewed council has exactly the same problem that had been present in his entire minority, right? So the nobles lack then an independent royal arbiter who can pick between them. And so this becomes even more complicated now in terms of this Game of Thrones as we set up the chessboard, and now there starts to be more pieces on it. So for example, when Henry is married, so they find a French princess, the niece of the king of the Dauphin, in order to and marry him off and have a queen. She now also is there present, and she now also has a vested interest in controlling his person, getting him to assent to all the things that she wants as a political player. And she's French royal princess, and she has her own ideas about how things should go. So anyway, so now we're getting back to Game of Thrones, right? So we have that with all that kind of context of the Wars of the Roses. Although the situation with the kings differ. So here we have Robert Baratheon, who is the usurper at the time of the beginning of the show, who's been reigning for a whole long time, but has devolved now to being a very weak king who's mostly spending his time getting drunk all the time and going out and hunting boars. Anyway, this is sort of where this period of history is kind of where in the Game of Thrones that you can identify most of the pieces lining up, right? So, for example, what ends up happening is that the weak King Robert is incapacitated, and that initiates then a regency crisis as the different players in the council try to act in his name and operate in different ways in his name. An example of this, how this probably works, is Henry VI's powerful cousin, Richard, Duke of York. He enjoys for a time this kind of ascendancy in the council and kind of starts to steer and lead control of the government. And so that, by analogy, a lot of different people have said, well, that's sort of like what happens when King Robert Baratheon of the Westeros, his friend Ned Stark from the north is brought down to be hand of the king in order to be his ally on the Regency Council. But obviously, Richard of York, Ned Stark, is opposed by Queen Margaret and her faction, who people have identified with Cersei, and obviously she's fighting to maintain her own control of the king and the government, and ultimately for her children or her son. So Margaret's faction at a certain point enjoys some ascendance, so she's able to have more intimate access to the king and is able to keep him more on her side. And that leaves I keep saying Starks now, but it keeps the Yorks left out. But at a certain point, when the king suffers a total mental breakdown and the Middle Ages is described as goes mad, so he's no longer able to respond to or say full words. He has a son that's born to him, but he's unable to acknowledge that or even be aware of the kid as being related to him, that kind of thing. When that happens and he's in this complete state of incapacity, Richard of York is able to assume control and be named protector of the realm. Like ultimately Cromwell has that same title in the future in the Commonwealth. So anyway, Lord Protector. So and then we can kind of see he's wearing in the graphic here, right, the hand of the king thing. So Ned Stark is the example here again. However, the king gets better and suddenly can talk again. And so when that happens, Margaret's back. and so Margaret and her faction's in charge, and the queen is able to take control back, and they take the title back from York as Lord Protector. Anyway, and that goes back and forth. Ultimately, at this point now, it devolves down to the battlefield. So on the one hand, you want to be controlling the king. On the other hand, things have now gotten to the point where the two different rival factions are fighting with each other on the battlefield. And it's at this point then that the Duke of York loses an important battle in 1460, the Battle of Wakefield. And so, as happened to Ned Stark, his head is put up on a pike, and the Queen's forces are victorious in that round. However, he leaves sons, just like Ned Stark left Robb Stark as a son. Anyway, what's happening then too is now the battles continue in the next round of battles. Henry VI again loses his sanity, and he gets captured by York's son's Edward forces at the Battle of Towton the next year in 1460, not 8, that's a typo, 1461. So anyway, so now the king has been captured, and so that obviously affects the queen and her government. And so as a result of having the king, this Edward, so the son of the Duke of York, deposes his captain, his captive, Henry VI, and he has himself crowned king instead as Edward IV. And so this is now seemingly then a victory for the House of York. So now, anyway, Edward has a king, the preceding king from the Lancasters captured, and indeed Margaret and her son Edmund escaped to France. Of course, this is like we always happens, right? So once you get deposed, you run across the channel, and so the King of France immediately starts paying you a pension so that you can eventually go back and cause more havoc in England. So that's just the ongoing thing. So people have made the comparison then between this young Edmund and Joffrey, who ends up being obviously a very evil character in Game of Thrones, but apparently there's some things anyway in the sources where young Edmund is also quite a rotten, spiteful, self-righteous little kid. And so anyway, also similarly doesn't live long like Joffrey. So just when it looked then like a York victory, Edward IV broke off his engagement to a French princess for a love match of little political importance. And so if you have followed the show, that's what Robb Stark does. When he's suddenly winning the whole war of the Game of Thrones, he marries then out of love a girl that, anyway, he shouldn't have done in terms of the political thing, and it turns somebody against it. But oh well. So obviously that ends very poorly, and he and all the Starks get massacred. That does not happen to Edward IV. However, what does happen is it angers a bunch of his supporters, and at a certain point, it allows Margaret to return then Henry VI to the throne. So he has to flee to Flanders. So we've already had now, the Lancastrian king get deposed, and this is what happens. Like I say, if you put him in prison, you don't kill him. then again, the York king has him in prison. Then he has to flee, and so then the king that has been in prison is brought back out, and now he's king again. However, that doesn't last very long. So although Edward IV fled to Flanders, and Henry VI temporarily resumes the throne, although he isn't any more capable at all. Margaret obviously rules in his name. Before then, Edward and the Yorkists returned and defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury. They kill Prince Edmund. And so even if he was sort of, let's say, not quite as rotten as Joffrey presumably was, he was definitely braver than Joffrey because he actually dies in battle. So as opposed to Joffrey, who would mostly only brave when it came to punishing people. So the poor deposed, again, King Henry dies in prison, and this time he was helped along his way. And Edward IV resumes his reign, which then lasts for another 13 years, which seemingly is a final victory for the House of York. Except what ends up happening is that he dies, and he leaves an heir who's only 12. So little Edward V. And so Edward V maybe is going to get set up for having another one of these regency councils, a minority. Who knows how long until he would achieve his majority. But he actually remains uncrowned as he's brought into the custody of his very powerful uncle. So Edward IV's brother, younger brother Richard. And then Richard essentially assumes control of the realm. He then calls his nephew's legitimacy into question. So if you remember, there was that marriage issue that had caused Henry all that problem. So now what Richard says is that that marriage meant that, which was conducted in secret, meant that his nephews actually are illegitimate, so they don't have any right to inherit. And so therefore he should be the heir, and he has himself crowned as Richard III. Obviously, Edward and his brother are imprisoned in the Tower. While it's not exactly clear what happened to them, as they were obviously killed. Again, we've already talked about how dangerous it is to let a king, even a little boy king, to be free. I mean, this happened, we talked about this too way back with John and Arthur, so Arthur of Brittany also had the same fate, right? So they never emerged. Okay, well, so then there's no Lancastrians left, and Richard is in charge of the kingdom. He's now king. I'd say here, if he had allowed his nephew Edward V to reign, it seems unlikely that the Lancastrians would have been able to depose the House of York. So that probably would have been able to, Edward would have, who knows, unless he's a really bad king, or had the same kind of problems as, Henry VI or something like that, he probably would have been able to consolidate the dynasty. Instead, what happened here is by deposing his nephew, by creating this instability, by making himself essentially into a usurper, and also the unpopularity, even though you technically have to kill your relatives who are kings in order to be safe, nevertheless, no one likes it when you do it. And so it's also unsafe to do it, because when you do it, people are very angry. So that allowed then this guy, Henry Tudor, who is a Lancastrian exile with a relatively distant claim to the throne, to collect a whole bunch of troops again in France, and also then come back and invade. So having spent much of his life in exile in France, Henry Tudor has been often likened by different people to Daenerys Targaryen. So in the whole Game of Thrones story, she's spending all her time over in Essos and only comes back in the last seasons here. However, there's a big difference because she is obviously the Targaryen heiress, so she has a very strong claim to the Iron Throne, while Henry's claim is that his mother, Margaret Beaufort, was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt by his mistress, Catherine Swynford, which is to say, an illegitimate child's great-grandchild by his mother. And so it is really that's pretty thin broth. There's a lot of other people, including the kings of Portugal and Castile, that have better claims to the throne than Henry Tudor. Anyway, it doesn't matter because he was able to, because of what Richard had done, he's able to get the ships and troops from France, goes across to England, revives all of the different Lancastrians, everybody who's upset with Richard's rule, and gathers all together to Bosworth Field, where they have a big battle, and Richard III then loses the battle and is killed during the battle, and so that ends up being the judgment of what happens, although it could have gone just as easily the other way. So anyway, in 1458. And so, having defeated her uncle, so this was again the picture that was Edward the, I'm getting confused now. Edward IV and then Edward V as the little boys, the boys in the Tower. They have an older sister, Princess Elizabeth of York. She then marries Henry Tudor. And so what we end up having then is Henry Tudor, who's crowned as King Henry VII. He then brings together the heiress Yorkist Elizabeth. So the princes are dead, so the realm would pass to the female claimant, and his own claims then to the House of Lancaster, which we mentioned were a little tenuous. And anyway, between the two of those, he establishes the Tudor dynasty, and his son, obviously Henry VIII, has then the claim to the throne through the Yorkist. And so thus, the red and white Tudor rose, so it's together. The Tudor rose is red and white together. They symbolically then unite the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York.
Yeah, Henry Tudor also had a rather dubious claim to be descended from King Arthur. Okay. I think through his father.
Yes.
I can't remember the details,
yeah, so his
but it was very good PR.
Yeah, his father, Owen Tudor, is a Welsh noblemen, and so then they make claims all the way back to the British kings. It's also true that, I'm trying to think how it works. It's like, so Catherine of Valois, if you remember, who was the really bad king's mother who got sent away. She then has a lover who's a Tudor, and that descended from that line in the patriarchal line. So he's related then to the royal families, but not through any kind of legitimate way, And so anyway, so it is kind of a weak claim, but there's not any other male Lancastrians left, and so he's able to do that rallying everybody. So what we'll just say then, and kind of as we start to sum up here, the characters, events, the details of actual history, I think, are endlessly fascinating. I just barely skimmed the surface of all these different guys, and there's so much more to learn. Elizabeth.
Who did the wonderful pictures?
Yeah, so this is, I don't have the name, so this is, someone made these for a TED Talk. And so it's just a beautiful series of animations and stuff like that, and cartoons, and so I really liked these. And so when I ran out of pictures of everybody from the actual illuminations, I thought, well, we'll just use some of these. These are great. They also did these with the Game of Thrones. So history is obviously often stranger than fiction, although the magic makes fiction more strange, maybe. So just even to pull back, though, one more layer of history. So we have talked about kind of the way that this story is traditionally told, although I've deconstructed it a little bit as we go. But we have to always be aware, so that it was the story as it's traditionally told that inspired Game of Thrones. But the way it's traditionally told is a Tudor story. So in fact, when I said this thing about the red rose and the white rose and coming together for the Tudor rose, in point of fact, those use of roses is entirely retrospective. So that was not happening contemporaneously. So although the Yorkist faction did use a white rose as one of their symbols quite early on, the Lancastrians did not use a red rose at all until after the Tudors won, and they made that symbol of the two roses together, and so then they retroactively layered onto the Lancastrians this symbol of the red rose in order to tell that narrative that the Tudors brought the two together. So it's in fact a post, it's a convention that happens afterwards. And indeed then this name, War of the Roses, it really only gets popularized in the 19th century. And so this is not how people were calling it at the time. And this is one of the things that we always have to be aware of when we're reviewing history, especially history that's been well known for a long time and that was written early, because it tends to be written by the people who have an agenda for it early on. Yeah.
Of course, Shakespeare does have the red and white roses in his plays. Something else that struck me, and that's the Starks have a wolf's head, I think.
Yes.
And Richard III, his family's symbol was a boar.
Yes, right. So actually, like you say, the symbols at the time, so that final battle between Henry Tudor and Richard III, the actual banners that they were using is a boar's head, which, as you say, there's a relationship maybe to the dire wolf head in terms of inspiration, and what was the Henry Tudor using? So he's Welsh, and so he uses the Welsh pennant, which is the dragon. And so, just like the Targaryen, right? And so it looks like at that point, at that time. And so as you mentioned, Shakespeare. So Shakespeare certainly is using that Tudor narrative, the red rose and the white rose. The Tudors were promoting that. And Henry Tudor, is using that to show we brought the nation together. So we sometimes say history is written by the victors. In the Tudors' case, England's most celebrated playwright really writes the history of this period, or at least in terms of creating that narrative that's indelible in our brains. Everyone from, Henry V as a character.
Richard II.
Yeah. Yeah, and Richard II too, yeah, of course. Yeah, all of these different characters are very well known because of Shakespeare's plays. Even just this idea that Henry V had this kind of wanton childhood and everything like that because of the Falstaff cycle and all these things. There's not really a lot that's drawn from in terms of history, but it's indelible in our brains as a result of Shakespeare. What I would say instead, though, is that the Tudor narrative of England's Civil War frames the problem from the perspective of the Tudor solution. So the Tudor solution is that we're going to bring together two royal houses, and we're going to have, they each had a rose symbol, and now we have the combined Tudor symbol. In point of fact, that's like, anyway, to have that solution, they had to go back and say that's what the problem was. But there's no particular evidence contemporaneously to think that that was the problem at all. We've already talked about what the problem actually was, right? So when we remove our Tudor lenses, rather than seeing a century-long battle between two rival dynasties, the crisis really now appears to have been constitutional. So what happens when you have a king like Henry VI who has no will? That's really the crisis that has this happened. The nobles then need a monarch to arbitrate both the child monarchs and the usurpers that caused this chain of instability. But it wasn't that York and Lancaster were inimically opposed all the way before this. It's just that when they got to the end, that's how they treated their different claims, or they made their different claims at the time when it actually happened. So, okay, so how do we solve these kind of constitutional crises, this crisis that England was having? What about, for example, how they decided to solve it at the end of Game of Thrones? So at the end of Game of Thrones, as they've had all of these things, what they end up deciding is that they're going to eliminate hereditary monarchy, and so now the leader of Westeros is going to be an elected monarch only, and they elect a person. So would that solve this kind of instability of, these minority rule and things like that, or how would that work? And I'm going to argue that one of the things that can happen with elective monarchy is that ends up making weak monarchy, as the monarch isn't able to then build up their own internal lands and that kind of thing. And so it doesn't have to happen, but one of the ways, if we go back to the Central Middle Ages, England, France, and Germany all more or less started with very similar institutions, and they've all gone very different ways. And so where France, it got to a very serious absolute monarchy where the king had very serious control over all of France, and then lost his head, and now there is no monarch at all in France, to Germany, where the kingdom was elective, so the Holy Roman Emperor was always elected by the different main princes, the same way that all of the princes and princesses, anyway, all of the leaders of Westeros come together and elect Bran, and then whoever succeeds Bran, who will not necessarily be of Bran's house. And so then the electors are individually very important, but there is a centrifugal tendency, as what ended up happening is in Germany throughout the Middle Ages and early modern times, where suddenly then every one of those little electors is a kingdom, and even very tiny places become more or less semi-independent kingdoms within an elective empire. And certainly we had that already at the beginning of this process in Game of Thrones, where Sansa goes back to the north as Queen of the North, leaving then the newly elected king, her brother Bran, as not king of the 7 kingdoms, but king of 6 kingdoms. And so we can see where that might be the beginning of a process in Westeros that would end up looking like this ultimately. So, just to conclude, if we take Daenerys then as the stand-in for Henry Tudor, so what do we think of the outcomes of the two stories, the Game of Thrones and the War of the Roses? So Tudor obviously won his Game of Thrones and was crowned Henry VII. But would we have preferred a different outcome? I mean, obviously know that his son Henry VIII isn't going to end up being, one of the, anyway, he's a well-known king for sure, but not always thought of as being one of the best or most just kings or all those sorts of things. On the other hand, you can also see, just with this little bit of context of the lead up to it, why Henry VIII is so amazingly obsessed with the need for an heir, right? So on the one hand, his father has established a new dynasty, barely has any claim to the throne in any event, and all of this time in these preceding centuries, every time where they don't have an heir, it just ends up being, the Civil War fiasco kind of thing. On the other hand, his solution, Henry VIII's solution to that isn't, isn't admirable in any way. And so what about the Westeros? I know a lot of people were rooting for Daenerys to end up being crowned as queen and maybe marrying Jon Snow, who could be like a co-monarch or maybe not, depending on whether you guys liked him or not. Anyway, so how did it work out for either one? and you guys can decide. So. Yes, Valerie.
I'm thinking of another theme that's at play during this period of history, and it seems to be, not just in England, but as well, you see it in France, you see it in Russia, you see it in Japan, and that is a growing centralization of power, moving towards absolutism on the part of a central monarch versus the earlier feudal power of strong nobles.
Right.
And so I'm wondering whether, if you embed this particular narrative within that larger theme, whether that could be an instance of it as well, and, what some of the causative factors might have been, like, let's say, change of mode of production, from a feudal, very agrarian mode of production to growing urbanization, growing complexity of the financial system, growing trade, and as well, I'm thinking the coming of new types of arms.
Yes.
The sort of the rising dominance of artillery and even eventually the gun, and what that meant for the type of armies that would be put in the field,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. So I
Yep.
wonder if you have a comment about that.
Oh, yeah, I mean, exactly correct. So this is a large swash of history, especially if we go all the way back to where we were at with Edwards and back to John, right? And so one of the core things that's happening militarily is that, like you say, there is just a constant increase in military technology. A lot of times people think of the Middle Ages as this time period when everything collapsed technologically, but there's very little backsliding in terms of military technology. In fact, it's probably just a steady increase over what the Romans were able to do. What they lost in the Central Middle Ages and the Dark Ages was just large state control. And so, like you say, everything had devolved back to just what you're able to do within your own little zone as a leader or a count has to give certain lands in order to get feudal dues from a knight who's going to serve you in order to militarily and those kind of things. So already, though, in the war of the 100 Years' War, this has ceased to be a viable option. And so already there's so much more expensive military technology with the increasing armor, for example, the increasingly more expensive war horses, all of those kind of things that happen. And also, by the way, if you're going to have a war where you're going to fight it for 100 years and you are going to go across the sea in order to do it, you can't just have part-time knights come according to a feudal levy, and then you got to go over there for a bunch of time and be there a long time. And so they don't go for that reason. So it becomes professionalized, and we call that already here mercenaries, right? And so what ends up happening is that those knights end up paying tax instead of going. So they pay the tax, the scutage. And so then the kings are able to have money, and the money makes them flexible, and the money then allows them to buy more and more professional armies. And then at a certain point, when you're talking about centralization, the reason why this works in terms of economies of scale is that as a king is able to collect more money from more territory, they're able to have more power than you would if you're small. So as Germany is having this simultaneous collapse into tinier and tinier states, that's why by the time you're getting to the Napoleonic era, it's just able to be just bowled over. Because none of those little states, by the time technology has gotten to that place, you can't defend the kingdom of Baden-Baden, from France. It just becomes impossible. And so that centralization is happening for, like you say, economic reasons, also developing reasons of political theory, also. Frankly, the church supports it, and so you're getting the church always likes dealing with like one monarch and having that analogy to God and all that kind of thing, and so it's able to. All of those factors are bringing things together towards increasing centralization. But as we see with England's case, this has always been, with the backdrop of these nobles that have property all throughout the whole realm, and there's all kinds of English law precedents through this entire long and convoluted history of boy kings and bad kings and mentally incompetent kings and all these kind of things that allow the nobles to get these kind of different rights established, up to and including during the that period of time when Edward II's deposed, essentially formalizing Parliament as an institution. So that starts to also be an institution. I don't know. There's a lot of. It's almost a whole lecture.
Too, just as an aside, the coming of gunpowder.
The coming of gunpowder, yeah. So gunpowder and artillery. So by the end of this, so already the knight is becoming obsolete as of the 100 Years' War. So the English show that, and same thing the castles. Now, like you say, with gunpowder and artillery, by the middle of the 15th century, walls no longer stand up. They have to be completely reformed. And so all of this stuff, it makes it so that chivalry no longer has its place after a certain point. These kind of things are all become anachronisms. Institutions last longer, than their flexible capacity. The British still have a House of Lords, but the relevance of people like the Earl of Grantham by the time of Downton Abbey is pretty low, certainly now to this day. So, yes.
So Henry Tudor seems kind of random, right?
Yeah.
Like he just kind of appears out of nowhere. Was that? What do you know about him? Like, was that like? Were there people putting him up to it, or was he someone who was like, "This is my chance. I'm going to go take that," or like what?
Yeah. So he's. So while he's in exile, he's promoting himself as kind of like the head kind of Lancastrian in exile. There are all kinds of stories that are retrospective. So for example, while he'd been a prisoner and hostage too. While he's during those kind of wars that are happening, he supposedly has as a kid a kind of a one-on-one with the king, which implied that he was destined for greatness. The fact that Owen Tudor named him Henry, when nobody used a Tudor, nobody who was in any of those families had ever been named Henry before, shows that already by the time he was born, those guys had some ambitions. And so, if they just named him Owen, it would have been harder pressed to have him become King Owen. It could have been, but anyway, you know what I mean. The idea of it is that that they definitely portrayed themselves as kind of the leader of this deposed house. And it's at a certain point, if there's nobody else who's standing up taller, because all of these other the male line has been killed out after all of these battles. So as a result, nobody wants the King of Portugal to come and be king. So at a certain point, even if they have a better claim by common law, he's like the available guy. And so sometimes timing and location are everything. And so I agree with you that in terms of literary foreshadowing, this is a bad story because you'd want, wait a second, where'd that guy come from, But on the other hand, people may be confused, wait, Bran? Why did Bran win the Game of Thrones? Where did that happen? Or something like that. So maybe it makes sense if you look at it with squint, but that's also true for the Tudors. Yeah, Jane.
Surely in the case of the roses, I suppose in the case of the roses and the battles of the roses, the Catholic Church was playing an extremely important part, at least in the background, if not right in the foreground.
It was the Christian church in those days.
Yeah, so everybody, to Elizabeth's point, it's all the Catholic Church, but it's also all the Christian Church, so the Church of England, Western Christianity.
Say that breakup or its dissolution into two factions would have been playing a main role with who was supporting somebody's claim or not supporting somebody's claim. Or
Yeah. So the question is, was the Church of England, which is part of the Christian Church of the West, was it, or the Pope or somebody, were they putting their fingers on one of the scales either way? And in fact, there were, because the way that the Church and the bishops, the high leaders of the Church, are interconnected with the great houses, and so some of the Lancasters are in the royal family are made bishops, and one of them is a cardinal. And so at that point, they're part of the Regency Council. And so so they're on both sides, is what I'd say. So they're not. It's not like the church is on one side or the other. Generally speaking, when they're on the French side too. So the French ones are. And so at a certain point, when you need to be crowned king, you got to go get a bishop to do it. But they're always able to find one. So when the English have a problem, like for example, when they're trying to crown Henry VI. Because they want him to be crowned King of France because he's technically has inherited, but they've never crowned him. And the Dauphin has now made his way to Reims, which is where the kings of France are supposed to be crowned, and the Bishop of Reims has crowned him. And so now the English are like, well, we better go crown our king, because he's the real King of France. But they couldn't go to Reims because it was too dangerous, and so they had to go to Paris and crown him in Paris, which is not the tradition, right? But at a certain point, that's what you do when you have to do it, right? So same thing when Edward IV. The Yorkist has Henry, in prison, and so he needs to be crowned king. He's able to get acclamation from the Londoners, and I think that he's able to get like the Bishop of Winchester to crown him because they don't have the Bishop of Canterbury. So in other words, you if you can, you get the bishop who's going to do it, but the church is in enough factions that you almost always have. Some bishop to help out. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. And thanks everybody for joining us. Hopefully this was fun and interesting. And we'll talk next week about the Roman Constitution of the Roman Republic.